Hello, this is your instructor Dan Scollin, and I am going to be going through and doing an exam review. You will, of course, find the materials that I've provided for this week's review, along with a discussion that you're going to be participating in, which I hope will help you to prepare for the exam, which will be open on Friday and Saturday of this week. I wanted to first off thank you all for your efforts thus far in the course. I know it's not easy being in a fully online course where you don't have the face-to-face contact. And I wanted to thank you for taking the time to email me when you have questions, letting me know if there are things in the course that aren't appearing or things prematurely close, what have you. And keep working at it. I think we have some really interesting things that are being covered in the course and some interesting connections that I see all of you making, including some of the things that are happening in the news day to day. I think it can really enrich the course for you if you're able to make connections with the things that are happening in the world, maybe places that you're interested in traveling to someday or you've traveled before, and just understanding the basic nature of these places, their physical characteristics, their human geography. And again, I think it's something that is of great value and something that hopefully you're getting out of the course. So with that, we're going to go ahead and start in with our introduction. And of course, I've started off here with a map of the world realms. Our textbook uses this term realm to describe those very broadest of classifications of the Earth's surface. I sometimes think of these as super regions in that they cover this. There's uniformity to these areas, these realms, and this uniformity is going to be language, culture, geographic extent. In some cases, like South America, we've got a realm that covers an entire continent. In some cases, like North America, we actually have the realm, two realms dividing the continent between North and Middle America. North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa is an obvious case of where we're taking a continent and essentially splitting it because of cultural reasons. And we'll be getting into that more later. So with that, we of course are interested in the nature of this study of geography, and geographers recognize these 5 themes of geography, and this set of slides is designed to illustrate that. So we might take a particular place. This is actually an image, and we might sort of elaborate on the nature of this place. We might look at a photograph that shows some of the cultural practices at work. We might see some indicators of the nature of the natural vegetation in the area. And we could find the location of this. This is a map that shows the general or relative location of this particular location, which is Mindanao Island. You can see it in proximity to China, Cambodia, Laos, and of course as part of the Philippine island chain. And we could add more specifics related to the latitude and longitude. That is a measure of absolute location. And of course, there's movement that we could talk about in the context of weather systems, migration, things like that. Obviously, human-environment interaction that we saw with the guy out plowing the field with his water buffalo. So again, these are one approach to, or in this case, 5 approaches to understanding the nature of the study of geography, which we call the spatial science, because we're interested in these geographic patterns and geographic relationships over physical space. So we have these broad branches of geography, and we can look at the physical setting or the physical geography of a place. in terms of mountains, valleys, water, natural climate, native vegetation, tectonic activity, something we'll elaborate on more in a moment. So we have this basic map of the distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes around the world, and these follow, we now know, tectonic plate boundaries, where we have these interacting tectonic plates, and we gave particular attention to the Pacific Ring of Fire, including the west coast of North America, where most of us live. The Pacific itself, Hawaii, for example, you can actually see in the center of this great Pacific plate, and extending on into Asia, New Zealand, and around through the coast of South America and on into North America. Okay, we talked a little bit about climate, and I like to start with illustrating the bands of latitude that occur in alternating patterns on either side of the equator. The equator essentially travels and bisects the term tropics here. You can see a faint line corresponding. Just for reference, when you're looking at a world map, the island of Borneo, my personal favorite area of interest in the world, is a fairly symmetrical shaped island that's about the size of Texas, and you can see a dotted line going right through it on this map. So that's the equator. It's going to go a little south of this protrusion on the continent of Africa, and then extending a little north of the protrusion on South America that sort of connects as a puzzle piece, and that's the trace of the equator. You can see desert belts alternating either sides of the tropics. We've been focusing thus far on three realms that are in the mid and high latitudes, with some reference in our discussion of climate change to the polar latitudes. Okay, we're going to use this common system of classification known as the Köppen classification, after the German geographer who developed this system, and we recognize these broad letters to denote these areas that broadly fit these latitudinal belts that I outlined, although as one can see from the colors on the map that they are influenced by other factors as well, such as mountain ranges and ocean currents. And again, we can look then at these same climates, their broad Köppen classification code, but we will also need to insert highland climates into this map, and recognize that there are some desert climates that occur outside of the traditional belts, such as the deserts of Central Asia. Okay, when we talk about human geography, we could start off by looking at population distribution. This map's going to show 4 dominant population clusters. You see 2 in East Asia, in China, 1 in India, and finally a 4th in Western Europe. We also highlight here the megalopolis that is associated with the eastern seaboard of the United States, extending from Washington, D.C. northward towards Boston, Massachusetts. Notice that there are quite a few places in the world that have very sparse population, including the very high latitudes, parts of Central Asia, of course the Sahara Desert, much of the continent of Australia, the central part of the Amazon basin as examples. Okay, so human geography, sometimes referred to as cultural geography, is going to be looking more at how humans relate to and express themselves on the landscape. And of course, this is an expression of human-environment interactions, as illustrated in these various images. Okay, in your first assignment, you're looking at the topic of development. This is a common map that uses income to assess the relative development of different parts of the globe. Other indicators are things like life expectancy, political stability, health, overall health, and education indicators. And oftentimes, those will correspond directly to income levels, although not always. There are definitely exceptions to that. A related concept is that of core-periphery relationships, and more times than not, the highly developed areas of the world are going to be found within the global core, although when we look at maps of larger scale, finer resolution, for example, in Europe, we could talk about core areas within Europe and periphery areas within Europe. If we're looking at a world map, Europe would actually be considered to be almost entirely within the core and hereby represented by concentration of wealth, power, influence, and what have you. You can see the indicators of places that are in the periphery. Okay, so this idea of classification of geographic areas into realms and then into regions with a scale dependency is an important idea. Relative location, we're now talking about Europe, and we see some of the characteristics that have contributed to Europe having such prominence in the world today. Some of the characteristics of the population of Europe. Note that an aging population with low birth rates will have a negative effect on the population. However, immigrants can be the new workforce, the next generation of younger workers, although obviously there are tensions associated with new migrants, especially in the context of the refugee crisis now affecting Europe. Historically, we can broadly describe revolutions in Europe, the scientific revolution that ushered in the age of exploration, eventually leading to the system of mercantilism and the colonial system that came to have Europe occupy many parts of the globe. The agrarian or agricultural revolution that allowed for not the advent of agriculture, that happened much earlier, but in the 1700s, improvements in crop varieties allowed populations to grow, freed people from working on the farm, and corresponds closely with the Industrial Revolution. We see an urbanization taking place during this period as new devices and new machines are allowing things like the production of steam engines for labor-saving devices, the power loom being an example. And then the political revolutions, which range from the French Revolution that ushered in the modern state, the European state model, that is the model used today to define sovereign states in the world, as well as the devastating world wars of the 20th century and on into the present day. There are many places in Europe that could be considered culture hearths. This is Florence, Italy, which was the location of great thinking and ideas during the time of Michelangelo and Galileo, and as such is a classic culture hearth, in particular because these ideas diffused outwards to places far beyond their borders. This is an example that we like to highlight and give consideration to because it illustrates an ongoing challenge for not only Europe but other parts of the world, which is this process of political splintering in which devolutionary forces work to split areas apart, oftentimes as nationalist feelings are expressed, and those found within a political state wish to no longer be part of it. And in this case, it led to a devastating war during the 1990s in the Balkan Peninsula. The counter to that idea can be seen in the supranationalism of the European Union. Here we're looking at increased cooperation between independent sovereign states. We could see this in North America as well with the North American Free Trade Agreement. And of course, there are challenges, and some of those listed for the European Union deserve consideration. Next up, we're going to take a look at Russia briefly. We can start off by looking at a global map of biomes. These are world global life zones, and you can see they're generally described by the dominant vegetation that is found in these places. And in the case of Russia, we gave particular attention to the taiga, or the northern boreal forest, and its neighboring biome to the north, the tundra, or the Arctic tundra. These, of course, correspond to climate, and you can see the climates that dominate within Europe in relation to those that dominate in Russia. Again, look at the individual codes and their descriptions, so you have some familiarity with some of these general terms and concepts as they relate to these two realms in particular. Well, we've talked about a few different climatic concepts, one of which is continentality, which in particular affects Russia. Shifting into the human equation, the human side of the Russian realm, we want to have an understanding of the history of the Soviet Union and how this played out in initially a system of centralized state control with a command economy and collectivized agriculture that eventually became corrupted in a variety of ways that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union under then President Gorbachev, who not so much facilitated this demise of the Soviet Union, but simply stopped the military wing from enforcing this very strict adherence to this system of communism that was playing out at the time in the Soviet Union. It's important to consider both prospects and challenges for all geographic areas, and here we can see that Russia does have some very distinct opportunities, but some very distinct challenges as well, in particular this challenge of their population implosion, not to mention the corruption that is affecting the government and is affecting much of the population as well. We did have a presentation on climate change, which is most distinctly affecting the Arctic, and it's important to recognize that there are a variety of changes that are taking place that are affecting natural vegetation, natural wildlife, systems of ocean circulation, surface temperatures, and the like. And not all of those things will be negative for certain areas, such as Russia may see areas that are opened up to agriculture, for example, or opened up to sea travel. But at the same time, we're seeing a variety of pretty dire consequences in places like the Pacific realm as sea level rise comes to pass, extreme weather events, and we're seeing an indication of climate refugees, which are among those that are now arriving in Europe. One of the concerns is that we're seeing melting permafrost releasing methane and carbon dioxide, which are the two greenhouse gases that are contributing to climate change. Again, a variety of data such as glacial retreat that support the changing climate that we're experiencing. Shifting gears and looking at North America, we'll look at climate for a few minutes, and there's some principles related to the fundamental differences in climate from east to west that are illustrated here. And we want to recognize in particular in this section the importance of mountains. This is especially relevant on the west coast because we do have such high mountains. The economic eras helped us to frame our thinking around changes that took place in the economy of North America as we gradually moved from a more agricultural-based society to an industrial and then eventually a post-industrial economy. These in turn were used to frame our thinking around urban growth and some of the considerations with respect to transportation. Again, closely linked is this concept of industrialization, especially as it played out in the lower Great Lakes region, initially starting in about the 1850s and extending really at its strongest through the 1950s, maybe into the 1970s, before we saw this significant decline in manufacturing, although the United States still has a strong manufacturing sector. Okay, so we looked at urban areas, these very early, dense, walkable cities with mixed use. That term mixed use refers to both residential as well as retail, commercial businesses, all intermingled within the city environment, as you can see illustrated in this image of New York City from the 1880s. Eventually, cities were able to spread out as we started to see ferries and streetcars developing. Some of the negative effects of the city, especially noise and pollution, encouraged people to move out to the outlying areas and were the early steps towards this process of suburbanization and sprawl, which was greatly facilitated by the interstate highway system in the 1950s. And now we're starting to see some return to the city. Of course, some cities, such as Detroit, Michigan, have seen extreme levels of urban blight with very little investment into the central city. This was a motivator for folks getting out of the city, of course, this sort of suburban ideal, but of course the consequences of transportation gridlock has become a genuine issue. So now we're starting to see cities returning to a more dense and mixed use context. Okay, physiographic regions of North America. So this is going to frame our thinking a little bit. Some of the major drainage systems, of course, the dominant mountain ranges that will inform our thinking about our home continent. And of course, this is where we gave some focus to plate tectonics on the Pacific Mountains and Valleys region of North America. You can see the San Andreas Fault and the Cascadia Subduction Zone, which are two areas that affect California and we want to be familiar with. This region is characterized by its connection to Asia and the global economy, innovation and trend setting. Of course, Silicon Valley is an obvious shaker and mover, a modern culture hearth. as is Seattle, Vancouver, Portland, Los Angeles. Okay, we gave a little bit of focus in our look at the Pacific to Hawaiians and the Hawaiian Islands, example of high islands, some of the challenges and concerns affecting the islands, some of the unique qualities that define the island of Oahu. Of course, this hot spot tectonic process that has formed these islands, pleasant, uncharacteristically pleasant tropical climate. It's a very unique culture that developed around this most isolated of all island chains on Earth. By contrast, we'll see low islands, especially characteristic of the Western Pacific and Micronesia, parts of Polynesia and Melanesia as well. And these, of course, are extremely vulnerable to rising sea levels because they are so low in elevation. We are also seeing dramatic changes to the coral reefs themselves as coral bleaching has led to die-offs in some cases of 80% or more of coral reefs that are found in some of the most biologically diverse parts of our ocean environment. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope this helped you to frame your thinking around some of these subjects and maybe to inform a little bit of your online discussion. So I look forward to interacting with you in the discussion in the next few days before we embark on our first exam.